Not speaker. Mr. Walter van der Wegen, specialty clinical research in orthopedic surgery, osteoarthritis, and joint replacement since 2006. Orthopedic surgery within the Saint Anne Hospital in Geldrop, Netherlands since 2013 as an orthopedic sport medicine research team. For education, Mr. Walter from Leiden University get as a Doctor of Philosophy, PhD, in 2012 until 2014. And then from Universiteit Maastricht, Master of Science from 1996 until 2004. And then Avans Hogens Breda as a physiotherapy from 1984 until 1989. Let us proceed to the webinar. During this session, I would like to remind every participant to pay attention and write the questions in the question asked down below of the Zoom meeting. But if you want to ask directly, don't forget to click raise hand in webinar control and the host will be notified that you will raise your hand. To Mr. Walter van der Wegen, PhD, time is yours.
Well, good morning. At least it is morning in the Netherlands, and I think good afternoon to you all. It's very nice to see so many participants in this webinar, and I do now understand that your command of the Dutch language is much better than my command of the Indonesian language. So unfortunately we have to proceed in English, but I hope I can give you a lot of practical tips and tricks on how to set up and conduct your study in a very professional, high standard manner. And I'm very honored that so many participants are joining this webinar. So I'm going to start sharing my screen, and let's see what I can talk you through. So it looks like everybody can see my screen now, and we're going to talk today about how to set up and to conduct your study. So our topic for today, and the focus, of course, as you can see from my background, will be on clinical trials, is that we are going to talk about the institutional review board procedure, the study team, protocols during the study, the responsibility of the study team, good clinical practice, what does it mean and how can you acquire a GCP certification? How do you manage the follow-up of your trials? How do you manage your data? And we'll finish with some bits and bytes of advice and a summary. So hopefully this will be very helpful for you to conduct high quality, high level studies, because if they are high quality, high level, they will be easier to write as a manuscript and to get accepted as a manuscript. For medical science studies, there are, of course, a lot of different medical science studies. Maybe in your university, in vitro studies are done, where you work in the laboratory. In orthopedics, that might often be cadaveric studies, but also testing or hip or knee joint prosthesis on wear, for example. So in vitro studies don't involve humans, but are in the laboratory, and they require different conditions and also different qualifications. Next step is animal studies. I'm not sure on the situation in Indonesia about animal studies, but they are conducted in the Netherlands and Europe, but under very strict conditions. And if you want to do that type of research, you again need different courses and higher qualifications to make sure that the welfare of the animals is not unnecessarily maltreated. A lot easier is to do is, of course, literature studies. They can be quite hard to get all the literature, but you don't need humans, you need less qualifications, but they might be important, as you know from the pyramid of scientific evidence, that systematic reviews of randomized controlled trials are at the top of that pyramid. They're very important in medical science. And then we get the studies involving humans, the clinical trials. You can roughly divide them in either pharmaceutical, drug studies, and medical device studies. That's one way of looking at drugs versus medical device. And in commonplace, pharmaceutical studies, drug studies, are more rigorous, often require more patients. I think we all are aware of the amazing COVID studies where they did like 40,000 patients randomized within months. That's an awesome achievement. That is almost superhuman and very impressive to look at. But usually these studies take much longer to conduct. Medical device studies are studies where you use like an implant, like in cardiovascular surgery or in orthopedic surgery, and these are considered to be of a different risk level compared to drug studies. So the requirements are often a little bit less strict than pharmaceutical studies. Another way to divide or classify studies involving humans is looking at the age of the patients. And there are certain specific populations which require more qualification of the research team, especially children. If you do studies with children, the IRB, the Institutional Review Board process, is much tougher to protect those children. Often you need informed consent of both parents. And that might be sometimes very difficult if these parents are living apart. And then you, of course, have the studies involving cognitive impaired patients with dementia, for example. Because one of the important ground truths of modern studies is that you need informed consent. But how can you give informed consent if you're cognitive impaired? So we're going to talk on all these topics, but these are things to keep in mind, that there are different types of clinical studies and each of them requires a different set of qualifications, experience and training of the study team. So that's something to keep in mind. And I mentioned it a couple of times already. This is teamwork, and team might be short for together everyone achieves more. As a team you can do quite a bit more than on your own. And can imagine, say for example again the COVID study, 40,000 patients within a couple, maybe half a year, randomized. Nobody can do that on their own. So it's always a team. And what does a study team, a proper study team, can look like? There are a lot of people involved, and certain abbreviations are common sense standard terms in the international world of science, like the PI. The PI is the principal investigator. He's the head of the study. And the head of the study is responsible for conducting the study and that it is conducted in a professional manner to high standards. Often, and especially with multi-center studies where you have maybe 10 hospitals nationwide involved, each hospital has a study coordinator who's aware of all the protocols, where all the documents are, etc. So it's the SC. Very important, the boots on the ground, the people who do all the work on the floor, the study nurse. They will see the patients, they will plan the follow-up visits, acquire the data, maybe enter the data into electronic data capturing systems. So they're very important. But of course you as medical specialist and physician, you might be a sub-investigator with a certain delegation of logs. You are the one who checks the inclusion-exclusion criteria because that's very medical. Does this patient, has this patient been diagnosed with this type of reuma or whatever condition? Also important, only for a part of the study, and I say important, all the people are important in the team, of course, is the biostatistician. Because we all do science and we get our basic knowledge, of course, about statistics. But statistics in its own is usually a department within your university. So the level of knowledge of a biostatistician is always much higher on that topic than a general scientist. So you have to know what you're doing with statistics, but if you can, do get a biostatistician involved, because they can take your study to a much higher level. Something you might not be so familiar with is a data monitoring board. This is getting more and more common in the Netherlands and Europe, that an independent team, usually 2 or 3 people, another statistician, another scientist from another discipline, is independently of the study looking at your data. Is your data valid, correct, sound, and is it of high quality? You often have to, in big studies, which are a bit more risk burden, you have to present this in your plan, appoint a data monitoring board, and you can of course imagine, if you have such a DMB, data monitoring board, that the quality of your data will be of very high standards, because they will look from the outside to the inside of your study. A bit weird maybe, or uncommon, is to make patients part of your team. But if you do clinical trials, your patients are the most important. They are your data. They are the ones you want to onboard in the study. So you have to communicate rapidly with them all the time and make them part of the study. Then a bit more on the background can be the study sponsor. That is, in at least the Netherlands and Europe, often a bit confused as the one who's paying for the study, but that's different. In science terms, in Europe, the sponsor is the one who initiates and authorizes the study. So for me, as a scientist within orthopedic surgery, it might be that my faculty is the sponsor. They say, we want to do this study, you do it. So they're the study sponsor. But sometimes we have a financial sponsor, like industry. That can be a pharmaceutical or a medical device company. We have done studies where we introduced implants in patients for the first time worldwide, called first in men studies. And then the industry will pay for the study. This is very important, because then you get a conflict of interest, which is much tougher than when you initiate the study from the medical team itself. And there are certain restrictions on how to deal with these studies. With these studies, you often have to deal with a CRO and their CRAs. And the CRO is a clinical research organization. Worldwide, there are a lot of companies who specialize in how to conduct studies and help study sites with conducting the study. They are often hired by the industry, and they will monitor your data, provide a protocol, audit your study. Within a CRO, CRAs are at work. They are the employees, and that's a clinical research associate. They know all about good clinical practice and how to conduct studies, and they will do the monitoring of your study. So that's a big team to do studies. Basically, what we talked about last time is that you have an idea. And now we're talking about big teams and a lot of people involved, so you can look at a lot of paperwork. But there are some downsides and some upsides to all this paperwork. Because the first part of paperwork is your study protocol. And this is the most important document. This is where all your scientific thinking goes into the document. And this is a lot of work before the study starts. But if you do this correctly, it saves you a lot of trouble afterwards. Because mainly in the study protocol, and we're going to go through all the topics which are in the study protocol, your introduction of your manuscript and your methods are already described. It's much harder to think through everything in advance, but if you have done that well, and a lot of people have criticized it and sharpened your study protocol, then writing your manuscript is much easier, because it is already well thought out. So it speeds up your manuscript writing. So it takes a lot of time before the study, but it speeds up afterwards. There are a lot of templates, even in your university. I saw a very good template already, so use these. And they are very important for the clinical trials, but also with study design and with the manuscript submission, because if you have a high quality study protocol, your manuscript will be better, and a better manuscript is easier accepted. So it's a lot of work beforehand, but that's where you put your energy in the beginning. It's very, very important. So looking at a study protocol, what's in it? Well, basically, who's on the study team? Who's responsible for what? Who's the PI? Who's the study nurse? What are the qualifications? Then, of course, your background and rationale. You had your idea. This is what I thought. This is why I should do this study, because it's still a problem. It's not well thought out in science, so we need to do more studies. So that's your background and rationale. And your study aim. That should be like a single sentence stating, with this study, we aim to prove that treatment A is significantly better or clinically more effective than treatment B, something like that. So very important, because that puts your study on the point, on the edge. This is what you're going to do. This is important. Of course, that leads to a hypothesis, because in science, with statistics, we use a hypothesis, either a null and the alternative hypothesis, saying there's no difference or there is a difference. And based on your background, rationale, and on the topic, you can design your study, whether it will be retrospective, prospective, all the things we talked about in the first webinar. Another important part, difficult part, is a priori, so beforehand, decide your statistical power. And of course, how higher you want your power to be, the more patients you need, because the statistical power analysis will lead to your sample size calculation. But the sample size calculation is important. And why it's important? Because if you go to the institutional review board, you want to make sure that you have evidence that you are, to the best of your knowledge, going to include enough patients that with scientific certainty you can back up your results. But there's another issue to it, which I learned talking to the IRB as well, is that you don't include too many patients. We often think the more patients, the stronger the answer. But if I'm going to do treatment A and B, and my statistical power analysis says, well, in both groups you need 100 patients. And I say, I'm going to exaggerate a little bit, I'm going to do 1,000 patients in each group. Then I'm going to put, if the outcome is that treatment A is significantly better than B, 900 patients, expose them to an unnecessary treatment. So your sample size calculation is not only sufficient a sufficient number of patients, but also not too many. That's an important thing to learn as well. Next, you will have your main and your secondary outcome. Your most important outcome might, of course, be, with all the people involved here, what will be the pain score? Will it drop so much? Will this treatment lead to more reduction in pain score than that treatment? But of course, we will have secondary outcomes, like is it pain under certain conditions, or long-term outcome, or activities, or quality of life, which is very important. And you will describe in advance your measurement tools. Will you use an NRS scale, numeric rating scale, or a VAS, a visual analog scale? These are totally different. Measure the same thing, different outcomes. But will you use EQ5D for quality of life or other topics? You have to design all these topics in advance to get a high quality study. And as you see, the study protocol is a lot of work, because it's 2 slides already on topics. The informed consent procedure, who's going to do it? How many times have patients, how many days have patients to think the study through? This is a very important thing in the IRB procedure in the European countries. Only in acute studies with trauma, you can ask them to sign straight away. But usually patients are given often a week to read the patient information letter and to think about participating. So the informed consent procedure takes into account all these things. Who's going to sign the informed consent? How many days have patients to consider participating, etc. Very important, the inclusion and exclusion criteria. And this is a tough topic, because you want to be as precise as possible, but making it precise might exclude more patients. And you want to include patients, of course, rapidly, and get your study done very, very quickly, so you can move on to the next study. But inclusion exclusion criteria are very important. So saying, for example, in osteoarthritis, we will include patients with osteoarthritis. Maybe you can make it more specific by stating what person diagnosed that osteoarthritic condition, how long ago, and how qualified was this person. That makes it better. Is the osteoarthritic diagnosis made by a GP, or an orthopedic surgeon, or a pain specialist, or a physical therapist? There's some difference there for the quality of your study. And once you know all these things, it is a good thing to plan your study. Say, well, we're seeing about 500 patients a month with this condition. Looking at the in and exclusion criteria, I can already see that 250 are not going to qualify, so we have 250 left. Of these 250, I make an estimate that 20% wants to participate, and that will, if I need then 200 patients, it will be an inclusion period of 10 months. And of course, the burden which you're going to place on the patient is going to be very important for your recruitment rate. If we ask patients these days to take part in an e-health study, we're going to tell them, okay, we have this study, would you like to participate? And we will provide you this healthcare app. Well, that's not a very tough decision for a patient. Consider we're going to ask the patient, we have this new implant. It hasn't been implanted in humans before. We don't know what the outcome will be. We think it's a good thing, but we're going to implant it in your upper leg or your chest or whatever. Would you like to participate? Totally different story. Patients will hesitate, and your inclusion rate will be much lower than when compared to the first example. And this will take your study duration. And your study duration does not only include your recruitment rate and your recruitment period, but also the follow-up period. Of course, we want to know how patients are doing 2 years after your treatment, but then maybe having a recruitment period of a year, 2-year follow-up, that's a 3-year study duration. Maybe you can also suffice with 1-year follow-up. These are important considerations to think beforehand before you start your study. And these things combined will make your study flow. So where does the patient enter? When will the randomization take place? Where will the treatment take place? How many follow-up moments? So you get a flow of your study. Of course, it does need a statistical paragraph. What type of analysis will you be doing? And that's where you can get good help from your statistician. A data management plan. Also think about what I'm going to do with my missing data. You will miss data. Your monitors will tell you, if you have 100% data, there's something wrong. People will either not show up for follow-up, miss to return questionnaires. All these things happen in a normal study, and that's okay. But think in advance what you're going to do about these conditions, and there are statistical tools to deal with this type of data, and that makes your study again stronger. How to deal with adverse events, we will go to in that later, and it will include your references, and these are the important parts of your study. One thing to consider is that there are a lot of study guidelines. For example, the consort guideline. The consort guideline, and I've put the hyperlink in the slide as well, and we can share it later if you like. The consort statement has been thinking as an expert team, worldwide expert team, how should I conduct my randomized controlled trial? One of the more difficult types of scientific medical studies. And if you go to the website, you get a lot of advice and tips and tricks and help on how to do and conduct your randomized controlled trial. And often manuscripts will ask specifically, have you followed the concert statement, and report it in your paper. There are a lot of these guidelines. If you look at the Equator Network, and I've highlighted it on the right, you see all types of trials, like randomized trials, observational studies, systematic reviews, even study protocols. For each type, there is such a guideline. And high-level journals will ask for, if you have done a systematic review, have you followed the PRISMA statement? So these are very helpful to plan and to conduct and even to write your study. So this is a good tip to look at before you start your study. Now we get to the tough part, the medical ethical review. This is a difficult part because you often have to deal with this and you're not sure what is the best thing to do. And it also, I've learned, depends on the review board itself. In the Netherlands, we have 12 official review boards. And they're not all the same. Some are tougher than others. Some are a bit more helpful than others. I'm lucky to have a helpful one in the neighborhood, so I apply all my studies there, and they often think along. And it takes a long time to get for example, a randomized controlled trial can take up to 6 months to get it to their standards and to get accepted. So the first thing to consider is review board approval needed at all? You sometimes can get a waiver if the burden is low on the patient, the risk is low, you can get a waiver. You still apply the study with the review board, but usually what you have to send in is only a short document, and within maybe 2 weeks you can get an answer. But that answer is important, because in your manuscript you can then state and quote the letter number that you applied for RRB, but they waived a full review of your study. But that's only for studies where the burden and the risk for the patient is very low. This, of course, depends on national law, but I think it will tighten in many countries where it's still at a lower quality level. But in the Western countries, it's a substantial investment. A lot of documents are needed. For example, not only the study protocol, but also study contracts if there are, data protection laws, and where is your data stored. These are all very, very common things to get to the review board. I did do a quick search on institutional review boards in Indonesia, and I found this website. And of course, like all civilized countries, IRBs, institutional review boards, are present, and they are responsible for ethically reviewing the planned studies. This is the website of IGDOR Indonesia. I didn't know of its existence before I started to look, but you can have a look at that. And I also found a paper on research development in Indonesia. This is a 2018 paper, and if you can see underlined, the data is a little bit old, 2018, but it stated that the number of research ethics committees in Indonesia was still small, and only in a certain area of Indonesia. So what you can foresee that now, 2021, hopefully are quite a few more, but also they will get up to par, and they will develop and get more expertise. And that might mean that it's a bit more work for you as a researcher, because you don't get away with putting your study protocol on one A4 paper and submit it, but that you need to submit a substantial amount of documents before. But is this a bad thing? I don't think so. It's tough. It can be frustrating. Your study can be turned down. I had that once. Said we're not going to allow you to do this study, and then it's against the law if you start. Because what is their purpose? The Purpose of the institutional review board, look if there's the balance between the inflicted study burden versus the expected benefit. You can do quite a few things to a patient, implant stuff, take body material out, all possible, if you expect a huge benefit. If the benefit is very small and you want to take out part of their ankle joint, they're not going to allow you to do it, and rightfully so. Basically, they are balancing the risk with the benefit. So you have to keep that in mind when you design your protocol and your study question. And with doing so, they are protecting the patients by making sure the patient is well informed of the expected benefits and risks, and to make sure that the patient is well protected. This is important because in the human history, there are a lot of examples of misconduct in studies and unethical scientific studies, which caused a lot of grief in a lot of people. So yes, they might be a hassle, and they are a work if you look from the point of the researcher, but there's a good cause for that. And if you're lucky, you can get a review board which also thinks along. And my first study I submitted with the IRB, they said, well, we're not going to allow you to do this study, but we suggest you do this study. So they might even help you to get better ideas. And often they will look at AEIAs, serious adverse events, and SUSARs, and we're gonna have a look at that because these are major terms which are worldwide known in science. Okay, so the AEIA is any untoward medical occurrence in the subject, and it's something to get used to. Like if you have a high quality study, any medical event. So say I am looking at implants in cardiac surgery, and the patient comes in the 1 month follow-up, and he states that, well, since the surgery where I got my cardiac implant, I have a lot of headaches. You think, what do headaches have to do with cardiac implants? Maybe nothing, but it is an adverse event because it's any untoward medical occurrence. So headache, if you get infection in your toe, whatever, you document it in your study. Because certainly with first-in-men studies, these might expose unknown or unexpected correlations with the treatment. Because if you have multi-center study and in your population within your hospital, you notice in 4 out of 10 patients severe headaches after this implementation, but that occurs in all the centers, then you have to look into it. So adverse events are important. Then we get to the serious adverse events, and they're a class apart. A serious adverse event is defined as an event which leads to death or a serious deterioration in the health of the subject. So life-threatening illness, permanent impairment, inpatient hospitalization, or surgical intervention. These usually, as stated in your study protocol, need to be reported within 24 hours. Because especially with multi-center, you have to keep an eye on serious adverse events. If there are more than expected, the study might be temporarily halted. And I think COVID is a nice example of where this was looked at very, very seriously. And besides to death or serious deterioration in the health, it might also lead to fetal distress, fetal death, or congenital abnormality. But that's of course only in certain studies. And then a very, very unexpected adverse event is the SUSAR, and that's a suspected, unexpected serious adverse reaction. So there might be in a study serious adverse reactions leading to death or hospitalization which have a serious consequence relation to study, but they were unexpected. So they have to be monitored and reported as well. So basically these are the 3 levels of adverse events, complications to really record and monitor in a study. And of course this is a bit weird when you start writing your study protocol that, well, I don't know what to expect, but coming from that idea to say, well, I don't know what to expect, but thinking about it, I have to keep an eye on it and report them and monitor them. So these are a different class from the series that first event. I already mentioned good clinical practice, and I don't know if you're familiar with the GCP. Basically, from a scientific, as a scientific employee, you think of it of all the rules, paperwork, and red tape around the studies. So basically, we have a brilliant scientific idea. That's what a new treatment. We designed ourselves, and we focus on that. But by doing GCP, you will have a high-quality data set and a high-quality study. So it might sound a bit boring because it's all the rules and the laws and the red tape around the studies, but it actually improves your data and therefore your results. And that also increases the chance of getting your paper published because you've done everything by the book. This is what GCP is. And GCP is easy to follow online courses to get trained in it. These are available worldwide, and that will leave you with a certificate, which, if you have to do certain studies, is required, and it needs to be submitted to the IRB board. And in a lot of universities, well, all universities in the Netherlands, and I think in many Western countries, you're not allowed to be part of the study team if you don't have GCP. And usually universities have internal training and courses for that. Well, and then you're finally there. You had your brilliant idea. You did very hard work and a lot of work on your study protocol with all the paragraphs in there. Your study team is there, and you already want to start. But unfortunately, under law in the Netherlands, you're not allowed to start yet until the investigational plan has been written and signed with all the responsible people. Even if the dean of the faculty is your sponsor, he has to sign. All the signatures have to be there. The opinion and the approval, if appropriate, of the ethics committee, the institution review board, has been obtained, and that has been sent in a letter to you. And then the regulatory clearance of approval. Often you get a multi-center, you get your IRB approval. If that's from a different IRB than from your hospital, you have to get local approval as well. Once that signature is in, then you can start including your patients. That's the way to go. That's a high-level study. And then you can start. And before you start, one more tip is to have a look at clinicaltrials.gov. This is a worldwide web site initiated by the US or by a US group, where you can register your trial, and high-quality journals will ask you, have you register your trial with clinicaltrials.gov, and can you provide in the manuscript registration number? And then you think, why should I do this? I have my protocol already in place and everything. Yes, you do, but your protocol is something which is on your computer. I can't check it. If you publish this on clinicaltrials.gov, I can have a look at what was your study ID, what is your study aim, your hypothesis, and very important, what was your main outcome and secondary outcomes. And are these similar as what is finally in your manuscript? So it's a type of scientific transparency. This is what you set out to do. And what it prevents is that if your results are not to your liking, it might be tempting to take another outcome in a subgroup which shows a significant effect and you're happy with. But that's not your main outcome. And by publishing your main outcome, you have to stick to it. So it makes and improves scientific transparency, and the higher the medical scientific journal, the more likely it will ask for a clinicaltrials.gov number. This is how the website looks like. You could also look for studies, and maybe not for your own study, but a good thing to do is, if you have this idea, I want to do this therapy for this type of patient, already look in this site And if you then find that 20 studies are already running on that topic, it might be wise to find a different study idea, because you will be the 21st study, and you get less likely to be published because a lot of studies have been ahead of you. So you can also use it to look if your topic has already been under investigation within one or many studies. Now you have your study running, and the data is coming in. There are patients coming in, and you're measuring how well they can walk, what their pain is, what medication they use. So you get in a lot of data. This is all data. This will transform into answer option 1, 2, 3, or 4, NRS score 6, EQ 5D score 20, all these things. You get a lot of data in. You have to manage this data, and that's a lot of work. And the basics are a case record form, a CRF. This is international language within monitors as well. Do you have a CRF? And I've showed you on the right hand side an example of one study we're running, how the CRF is built. It's a binder actually, where you can have 1, 2, 3, or 10 patients depending on how many data. You say, okay, we get a preoperative visit, and we get surgical data. We get a 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, 1 year. Medical events are logged. Adverse events are logged. Are there any protocol deviations? Was the visit outside the window? And a study complication. You can imagine if this is fully completed, and it looks like this. So you have like your subject ID, your initials, your study ID, subject ID, date of completion. And here you enter all the nitty-gritty details of your study. What is the pain score? How does the surgical wound looks like? All this is entered into this and signed off. If this is almost complete for each patient, you have a high quality study. Oh, back one. And one on the left is one from an industry study, multi-center, big, and on the right is one which an example of a CRF we made ourselves. A bit less fancy, but still we entered data on shoulder range of motion. We have some examples on how to measure this, how to use this tool. So these are all practical examples of how to collect your data. Then your data is, of course, transferred to an electronic system. I mean, you can't calculate your outcomes just by looking at the binder. So it needs to go into either Excel spreadsheets, not preferably, because that's less GCP proof, SPS or R software, and Castor. Maybe you're aware of Castor, but I'm going to show it to you. And another thing to do is to validate your data entries. I mean, typing errors are common. You have to look for that. Just do quick checks whether maybe with body weight there are very unlikely outcomes. And you have to go back to your source data. Data source verification. Is in your spreadsheet the weight 190 kilos, or should it be whatever 90 kilos? That's something like that was the one type error. And within your study protocol, you can already build in this quality control, saying, well, an independent observer will do a 10% data check. If that's all good, we'll leave it to the 10%. But we do studies where there's 100% data verification. So a CRO, a clinical research organization, comes to our hospital, 2 CRAs, clinical research associates, go through all the data and check whether we did everything right and entered all the right data. And you document that process as well. That's part of your quality control of your study. Here you can see an example of Castor. And Castor is an eCRF, an electronic CRF, electronic case record form. As you can imagine, if you have 5 studies participating in your study, having a CRF is very important, because everybody enters the data and collects the data in the same manner. So that will give high quality of data. But to get all the data together, we will enter it in an electronic system. And here you can see we have 3 studies in this system: a lumbosacral study, fast track after shoulder arthroplasty, and the REDAP is on hip arthroplasty. And if you open a patient within Castor, this is what it looks like. Saying, okay, the 1-year patient reported outcome results are, and you can enter the data here straight from your CRF. And that makes it easier for analyzing your study later because all the data is in a central point and well protected. This is what it looks like in the background. You can see some mess on my desk, but this is one of our studies, and we have an Investigator Binder. We get this binder, this paperwork, and in this paperwork it says, okay, who's involved in the study? Who's the study team? All the documents about the ethics committee approval, the clinical trial agreements between the hospital and maybe the company, the SIP, the clinical investigation plan. This is what we're going to do. The case report forms, the CRFs we just talked about, the patient information letter and the consent forms, study logs, delegation logs, visit logs, authorization logs, the resumes of the involved research team so that we know they're well qualified. If payments are involved, maybe if patients are completing the study, they will get some payment. That's in there. Product information and some other bits and bytes. You can imagine if you have this at each site, you can have a high quality study. This is an example of a delegation of authority log. And in the bottom of the picture, you can see all kind of research tasks like like subject screening, assessing eligibility, perform physical exam. And based on qualifications, persons on the study team, like Dr. Das, he's an orthopedic surgeon, he can make the diagnosis. Romy is one of our study nurses. She's not qualified to make a diagnosis, but she's qualified to enter the study, data because she was trained on that, and that's logged in this type of delegation logs. And then an important thing is to optimize your inclusion rate. And this is again on clinical trials. This is of course not the case for literature reviews or maybe in vitro studies. But especially medical science will involve clinical trials, randomized controlled trials, where you try to get in your sufficient number of patients. And that's always tough because not all patients are eligible. They don't fit the inclusion-exclusion criteria, or they don't want to participate because they're too busy to come for follow-up or whatever. So if you produce regular reports on your study status, especially with multi-center, we get newsletter from the READAP study saying, okay, you were the best including center of the month. Cheers for you. That helps to optimize your inclusion rate. But also at your hospital, provide reminders of inclusion-exclusion criteria, like make a small card and put it on the desk of the doctor who is not involved in designing the study, but maybe sees patients in his outpatient clinic who might be eligible for the study, and make the process easy. If it's a lot of work for the doctor, he's too busy, he won't include the patient. So optimize the onboarding process of eligible patients. Quick call to the study nurse who takes care of the rest does wonders. And keep track of how many patients decline to participate or are excluded. That's part of the concert statement. How many patients have you seen and how many were included? That should be reported in your manuscript. If you don't have that data, a high-level journal will not accept your manuscript. Also, with reasons why. So this needs to be detailed. We're getting to the end, and I'm going to share some bits and bytes. And first thing to say is get your good clinical practice, because that. If it's not the case already in Indonesia, I'm not sure of all the local and national laws in Indonesia, but it will get there that it needs to be done, and especially to get your manuscript accepted and published in a high-level study, you need this type of training. And then all the people who are trained know what to do in a proper manner. So make a case record form, clinical record form, preferably electronic, with paper backup. We've seen some examples, but that will make your data acquisition and data collection much more solid. So that's very important. Provide a study binder. We've shown you a picture of it, even for single center studies, because there are still a lot of people involved, and you can have a quick look in it if you have a question about a patient or a follow-up moment. But certainly it's also almost mandatory for multi-center studies to make sure that everybody has the same type of data collection and it's of high level. Work with SOPs, we haven't mentioned this yet, but standard operating procedures. And this basically a description of what you do during each step of the process with interacting with patients and during the study. And work on the inclusion rate to keep the motivation high. And if that goes well, you're happy to do the study. So in summary, we're getting to the end of the presentation and hopefully to some questions and answers. Check your review board. Can I get a waiver or do I need to do a full application, which is a lot more work, but worth it because it will get a higher quality paper. Invest in your study protocol. As stated before, it saves trouble and time afterwards. Another thing to consider is to publish your study protocol. And in the beginning of my scientific career, I was not sure what to think about it. I thought it might be an easy way to get a PubMed hit. But again, like clinicaltrials.gov, this is scientific transparency. If you have published in a journal your study protocol and later on the results are published, you can match them and say, hey, did he stick to his plan? Is this a high quality study? And there are journals now. We even state, Acta Orthopedica is a famous journal within orthopedic surgery. It says, if we accept your study protocol, if it is of sufficient and high standards enough, and we accept it and we publish it, then we will guarantee we publish your results if they are similar in a similar manner conducted as the study protocol published. So you get 2 publications. So I think it's important, and you see it more and more being common, and it improves scientific transparency and therefore quality. Remember, literature studies and in vitro studies, they may take a while, but randomized controlled trials, brilliant studies, but they always take longer to complete than when than the calculation you do in your protocol. It's often tougher than you think. Patients not always want to do or to participate in the study. Cherish your research team, especially your research nurses. They're important. They, as a busy doctor, they can take a lot of work out of your hands in scientific studies. So praise them for that. They're very important. Stick to your research plan when writing your manuscript. You have to when you have published it on clinicaltrials.gov and as a paper. And based on the discovered effects, implement the study in daily practice. And this is why we do all this work, of course, because we have found this brilliant treatment. We thought it out. Now we have the results and it works better than standard treatment. Your study isn't over yet. You have to work on implementing the study in your practice. So, to finish off, I want to have the same quote as I started the first lecture with. Remember, scientific writing, it's a lot of work, it's a lot of frustration sometimes, but it gives you a lot of joy because it advances healthcare and thereby improves the life of our patients, and therefore it's very important for medical science. Well, thank you for listening, and we're open for questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your insightful session, Mr. Walter. We can wait moving forward to discussion session, which will be conducted in several sessions. For the question and answer session, we will have 3 questions first, then already collected through the chat box. Let me see, but first I will ask in the chat box, I will ask Dr. Agus Sunandar, anesthesiologist, colonel. Would you like to join the conversation to ask directly your question to Mr. Walter, Mr. Agus, Dr. Agus? To Dr. Agus Sunandar, anesthesiologist. All right, I will read the questions from Dr. Agus Sunandar, anesthesiologist, colonel. Good afternoon, Mr. Walter. I would like to ask some questions. Which handbook and guidelines or platform do you use to improve your research and writing? And would you like to recommend that our other researchers or writer to us? Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. That is a very good question. And I think the most important sources are the one I provided in the presentation. So I look at the Equator Network, and if you're a little bit longer in the research, you already know by heart that if you're going to do a randomized control trial, you always go to the concert statement. And if you go to going to do a systematic review, you will have the PRISMA statement. One helpful thing to do for that is already think in advance about what journal are you aiming for. Are you aiming for the British Medical Journal? Then look in the author instructions. They will have these tips in there as well. So if you read the author instructions carefully beforehand, they will often guide you to these guidelines, and then you're sure that you will meet the standards of that journal. So always look at the author instructions of the journal, which is your first choice, and that's an important thing to look at. Very good question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. To Dr. Agus Sunandar. For Dr. Agus Sunandar, is there any questions to Mr. Walter? Or do you have another questions? All right, we move to audience. Maybe there's any audience raise hand for asking. Yeah, I present Dr. Al-Anas from Department of Pediatric to ask Mr. Walter directly. To Dr. Anas, please, time is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, Dr. Walters. I'm going to have several questions regarding to the research design in context of the meta-analysis and also for the systematic review. We are knowing that we're going to follow the PRISMA charter, right? So is it okay to compare head-to-head or to do the head-to-head comparison with different measurements? For example, I'm going to do the review for the pain management or the pain evaluation. Is it okay for me to collect and do a head-to-head comparison between these different journals with that using kind of different methods in evaluating pain? First, that's the first question. Second of all, is that you keep mentioning about the high standard journals or high standard articles, but in Indonesia, especially in my faculty, it is pretty well known for us to have the Key1, Key2, Key3, the Scopus Index journals. Does it matter that much or what's not? Thank you, Mr. Walters.
Well, thank you for this interesting question, and I was getting a bit scared because you're from the pediatric department, which has tougher studies, I think, to do. But the literature study is, of course, not very relevant whether you use children or humans. But on your first question, whether you can different outcomes, if you think about statistics and using a composite outcome using different outcomes, then I often thought that it would be very strict and that it would be like an algebraic, a mathematic decision. But I learned that in statistics, it's not the case. It's more gray. So it depends. So the answer is yes, you can do it, but it depends, and it depends on how far away are the outcomes that are generated in relation to your question. So if your question is more on general pain, then it's okay to have different outcomes as long as you report there are different outcomes. But if and in systematic reviews, the term heterogeneity or homogeneity, even for the population, but also for the outcomes, is important. So as long as you report on it and you can make a scientific reasoning that it is okay, and the reviewers accept this reasoning, it is okay. But there's of course a certain extent to where you can go. Say one study has measured with a pain scale, but only at 1 month, and the other study only at 2 years, then it's going to be tough to get a scientific reasoning behind it. So It's not a mathematical decision. It's not, I calculate it and it's yes or no. It's based on your medical expertise and your scientific expertise, and you build a scientific rationale behind, yes, I can combine these outcomes. And then you see if the reviewers accept your reasoning or not. So it's more, I wouldn't say a game, but something you evaluate and then do. And can you repeat the second question, or shortly? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. You're talking about the high standard journals, right?
Oh, yes.
Or high standard
Yeah.
articles. The Indonesia will tend to become so dramatically impacted by the Scopus Index journal, for example, that the Q1 and the Q2.
Yeah.
How does it matter actually, and how big and how major the impact for us?
That's a very good question. That depends on a lot of factors. Basically, the idea in science is, of course, if you have a very important finding, which saves a lot of lives or a lot of misery in your patients, the higher your journal, the more readers it will have, and the better exposure worldwide. So you have a very important finding, and you only publish it in a paper that it's only been has readers in the Netherlands or in Indonesia. That's not what you want. You want the whole world to benefit. So that's, I think, the main thing. Also, but that probably depends on the Netherlands or the country. The university in the Netherlands, the status and also the budgets divided between the different departments within the university are partly based on your output, and output is then measured in how many manuscripts and are they in Q1, Q2 or Q3. So if you're in a Dutch university, it's quite important for your budget to get enough high quality output. If you're in a general hospital, it's less important or not important. So these are two considerations why you want to go to a high level journal, which will have a high rate of the rejection of submitted manuscripts, which is much tougher. And of course, the third series will be about writing, but also about submitting your manuscript. What are tactics to use that? So, but I think these are the two main considerations, and that was a very nice question because it's very important and very, very relevant to your scientific work. I hope that answers your questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Walter. So what about Dr. Anas? Is there any questions to Mr. Walter?
That's enough. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Warles. Thank you, Dr. Shuada.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, we move to the next questions in question and answer box. There's from Wahyuni Rahmadina Swipe. Good afternoon, Mr. Walter. I'd like to ask for some questions. How to write a high impact factor article, and I'd like to know what are the characteristics of scientists writing for an excellent scientific article. And for the second questions, do you usually submit pre-submissions and queries? What are the advantages and what do you usually write to get the best feedback? Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you for these questions, and they are of course very relevant for us scientists because our output is what we tell on international conferences and the papers we publish. And I think we touched upon a lot of topics which are required to get a high quality paper. I mean, your data have to be sound and solid, and your plan has to be well thought out and well executed. And that's what we went in today. So if you follow all these steps, you should have a high quality paper. But there's one important thing which we didn't touch upon today, but in the first session, it should be a relevant topic. I can do a high quality paper on something which is already, a high quality data collection or study on something which is already well known or not of any scientific interest. And that changes over time. I did my PhD on a certain type of hip implant. It's not used anymore. So if I can still write a very well conducted study on because it's not longer used. So that's where you have to have your scientific ideas and expertise as well. What is relevant to start a study? And that's why I think it's important that I mentioned the clinicaltrials.gov, not only to register a study, but often you have an idea, a scientific idea, but unfortunately you're not the only one in the world. And maybe 10 other groups already had that idea and have started their study, so you're lagging behind. So you can check that on clinicaltrial.gov as well. So these are things to consider when aiming for a high quality study. Your study needs to be conducted in a solid, high quality manner, but also the idea has to be good, novel, and you should be one of the first to do the study. I think that's important for a high quality study. Does that sufficiently provide an answer to this question, or please let me know if you want to know something more.
Okay, to Wahyuni Rahmadani, is there any questions? So it's mean like high quality data collect are important, so we have to be check it first, right, Mr. Walter?
Definitely, and that makes it a lot more work before you start your study. But once you have done it in that manner, it's easier afterwards. Sometimes in clinical practice, we have this idea and say, oh, I'm doing this in practice. Can you have a look whether it works? And then without much plan, you're going to do some measurements in a few patients. And then you think, well, it looks really good. I'm going to write a paper about it. But then you have not sufficient patients. You're missing out on measurements. You didn't do it at the proper time. So spend that time in advance. It's a lot of work, and sometimes you do all the work in advance and then find out it's still tough to publish. But if you do the other way around, you have a good clinical idea and you just pilot it and only have a few patients, it's very, very tough and a lot of work to get all your data right afterwards. And often it's impossible. So it's a sort of balance. Do I do all the work in advance, get it easier scientific life afterwards, or do I just start, collect some data, and then it's very tough to publish because I don't have so much solid data. These are the things to consider.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mr. Walter. So we have another questions. Is it okay to you to answer a few questions, Mr. Walter?
Sure. Yeah, I still have some time.
Okay. The next question, how we combine a paper? Is it possible to conduct research through the interdiscipline study? How we manage that?
Oh, that's thank you for that question. Very interesting one. I think that modern medicine and science is going that way. I think we come from a background area where you were more focused within your specialty. And with modern communication tools, it's easier to get larger groups and get more input from other disciplines as well. But of course, it's getting a bit tougher and a new playground, because what might be important for internal medicine, say with anticoagulation around an orthopedic surgery, of course they have a different view on anticoagulation than the surgeon who's doing the surgery. So it's tougher to get not the team together because you have modern communication, but to get a common view on your study. But what we see is that there are nowadays larger data collections where you do sub-studies in. So the data collection is already running, and subgroups dive into parts of that data. So that's a manner to get that done. And the best thing to do is get to know each other, visit each other. When I did my PhD on metal implants, an important part was radiology. I wasn't very familiar with radiology. So as a scientist, I just visited the department, worked with them, learned from them, and that made it easier to talk to each other because I had some basic understanding of what they were doing. But I also told them about what we were doing. So just get in touch, visit them, Don't send an email or phone call, maybe to start, but then go over there and look at what they're doing so you understand their perspective. That's the most important thing to get a multidisciplinary collaboration started, I would say. Hopefully that helps.
That's really wonderful. Yeah, get to know each other. That's a great mark.
Yeah.
That's the important
Definitely.
one. Get to know each other.
It's teamwork, huh?
Team, right?
Yeah.
And then for the next questions, maybe the last questions, Mr. Walter.
Okay.
This in Indonesia, we had an ethic commit. Sometimes we got a problem about extended our study about humanity because the culture in Indonesia. And then after that, that's really hard to pursue the someone or passion to join our study. So what is your consideration about that one? Because sometimes
Well,
the people will ask about what happened with me if I join this one, or I will get a law or something, or I can get
yeah.
something punished on the world. So
Yeah, that's a very important question. Thank you for the
that's
question, and also a bit difficult for me coming from a different background. Although I can make some extrapolation there. In the Netherlands at the moment, there's some debate about COVID patients getting into the intensive care unit who are based on religion, not vaccinated. I think it's a wrong discussion, but it's what's happening, and it's sort of similar to a study. So I think that's why your inclusion rate will always be lower, because these are the things you not easily think about when you plan your study, and you have to respect that, because I think if you sort of force your patient into your study, he will be a dropout. He will then sign informed consent, and then a week later gives you a call, I'm not participating anyway. So what I usually say to my patients is, I want you to go through the patient information letter. It's very clear, it's very elaborate, it's a lot to read, but I rather have you on board in the study fully knowing what you're doing than hesitant. If you're hesitant, don't do it. It will slow your inclusion rate, but if people then in that manner on board in the study, they will follow through the whole study. So it's again a balance. Will you lose some patients in the beginning or the end? But I think for a study, high quality, it's better to lose them in the beginning, then have all your onboarded patients through the full follow-up of your study. That might be for religious or educational backgrounds. Not all patients understand what you're doing, even though you have to do your patient information letter in layman terms. And that happens. And I must say, I do a lot of studies where our orthopedic surgeons have to pick out the patients. And I say, if you get a feeling that the patient won't be compliant, don't ask. So these are practical advices. Yeah, these are very hard to put in the study protocol. Hopefully that helps.
yeah. Thank you so much, Mr. Walter. Okay, maybe that's the last question for today. We had a schedule for series 3, right, Mr. Walter, for the next season?
Yes, I have to go to the next meetings, but I enjoyed being here again. Again, thank you also for moderating and for the kind words in the beginning and for all the interest. So I'm very honored. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mr. Walter. This has been a wonderful conference. I have enjoyed listening to the talk about a ranger, the study, conducting a paper. It's a good clinical to learn about how excellent research. Thank you so much for that. A wise person once tell that going to conference was like taking vitamins, but it's more than that. So nowadays, clinical research is extremely important that allow doctors to decide the best treatment for the patients. It's make the development of new medicine, new procedure, and new tools possible. Without a clinical research, we will not be able to decide if new treatment are better or not for the other current treatment. And this conference could not be have been without you. Thank you so much for Mr. Walter. Thank you so much for the anesthesia, journal anesthesia and pain, anesthesiology and intensive therapy study program, corporate with Perdatin Malang for conducting this webinar. This journal will be continued, so will be the webinar series. So maybe we will have opportunity to be together again in another time. Thank you so much. Finally, I would like to thank our distinguished keynote speaker who shared their valuable experience all the plenary sessions, all the authors, reviewers, and all the participants who have contributed to their effort and assistance in organizing this event and ensuring the success of it. I do hope that this webinar will be able to impact all of us, greatly foster and empower the society through the science. So please keep in mind that we still have various seasons afterwards with Mr. Walter, a few seasons. And then to conclude, thank you so much for great contribution and looking forward to see you in the next webinar. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mr. Walter.
Thank you very much. Have a very nice day.
Have
See you
a
next
very nice
time.
day. And then
Take
Thank you, Walter.
care.
thank you.
Bye bye. Bye bye.